The maid who carried in the soup had a Latin grammar in her apron pocket, and the Duke of Redmayne saw the corner of it before he had so much as tasted the broth. He said nothing. He had spent 11 years saying nothing and looking, and it had made him, by the estimate of every man who did business with him and did not know who he was, the most unnervingly quiet gentleman in England. "Mr. Hardray," said his host expansively, "you will find us plain here. Plain but honest. We do not go in for London ways at Fenimore." "So I see," said the Duke. Mr. Edmund Ashby of Fenimore Grange had put on his best coat and his second best manner, and he was talking as he had been talking since 4 o'clock about his own merits. He had a fine, carrying, confident voice, and he used it the way a man uses a stick on a hedge, beating steadily in the hope of putting something up, for Mr. Ashby wanted the Redmayne stewardship. It was worth 800 a year, it carried a house, and it had fallen vacant at Michaelmas, and half the gentlemen in the county had been writing letters about it ever since. And the Duke of Redmayne, whose stewardship it was, had done what he always did, which was to put on a plain coat, take his mother's name, and go and look at the man in his own house. He had learned the trick young, and he had learned it from watching his father be deceived for 30 years by men who bowed low and starved their tenants. You could not know a man by his letters. You could know him at his club, or in your own drawing room, where he was on his best behaviour and had everything to gain. You could only know him at his own table, by the way he spoke to the people who could not answer back. "The soup, my dear sir," said Mr. Ashby, "is one of my wife's, God rest her. Girl, the other dish, the other dish. Are you deaf?" The maid set down the soup. "Yes, sir," she said. She was young, 21, perhaps 22, in a plain stuff gown and a cap that did not fit, with her hair pinned up under it in a fashion that suggested somebody had done it in a hurry and without a glass. Her hands were the wrong hands, he noticed it at once. They were reddened, certainly, and one knuckle was grazed, but the nails were kept, and there was ink on the middle finger of the right hand, the particular smudge a person gets from writing a great deal and not from carrying coal. She did not curtsy correctly. She curtsied too well. And when she leaned to set down the dish, the Latin grammar shifted in her apron pocket, and he read the gilt on the spine, and the Duke of Redmayne, who had come to Fenimore Grange to look at a man, began very quietly to look at something else entirely. The dinner was a catastrophe. It was meant to be a triumph, and that was what made it a catastrophe. Mr. Ashby had ordered up a dinner for 8, and had a household to serve it of exactly 2, an old cook, and this one girl, who came and came again with a colour rising in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. There should have been a footman. There had plainly been a footman once. The man's absence sat in that dining room like a hole in a tooth. "You will forgive the service," said Mr. Ashby, laughing too loudly. "One cannot get good people in the country. My man is above stairs with a fever, most inconvenient." "It is no matter," said the Duke. The wine, lord. She is a slow creature. We keep her out of charity, Mr. Hardray. The parish would have her else." The maid's hands did not falter on the decanter, but the Duke of Redmayne was watching her face, because he had spent 11 years watching faces, and he saw the thing that went across it, not shame, not anger, but a flicker of pure incredulous hurt, gone in a half-second, buried under a servant's blankness so quickly that he doubted his own eyes. Out of charity, he looked down at his plate. "Then it is fortunate," he said, "that you are a charitable man. Ha! Well, one does what one can." The Duke turned to the girl. "Thank you," he said. "The wine is very good." She stopped. It was the smallest possible pause, the space of one breath, no more, and then she filled his glass and stepped back to the sideboard and stood there with her hands behind her, exactly as she should. But he had felt it, across 3 feet of mahogany, as clearly as if she had put a hand on his arm. Nobody, he understood, had said thank you to her in a long time. He walked in the garden after dinner, because Mr. Ashby had gone to sleep over the port with his mouth open, and because the Duke of Redmayne had a great deal to think about and could not think in that house. It was a fine cold night, the last of September, and Fenimore Grange stood grey and shabby in the moonlight with 2 shutters hanging and the ivy gone into the mortar, and he stood on the ruined terrace and totted it up the way he had learned to. The estate was mortgaged, he had seen it in the fences. The library window was broken and mended with paper. There was no footman, and there had not been a footman for a year, and the dinner tonight had cost, at a guess, a quarter of what remained to them, and had been laid before a man Mr. Ashby believed to be nobody in particular, a duke's clerk, a paid inspector, a person of no consequence whom one might safely bully, and one's daughter. He stopped. He stood on the broken terrace with his hands behind his back and looked up at a lit window on the first floor, and everything he had seen at that table rearranged itself in one motion, like the pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The hands, the Latin, the curtsy that was too good, the cap that did not fit, the old cook, out of charity. Fool, said the Duke of Redmayne aloud to himself. She was not the maid, she was the daughter of the house. He was still standing there, 10 minutes later, when he heard the kitchen door open below him and someone come out into the yard and set down a pail, and then, in the dark, a sound he had not expected at all. She was laughing. It was a small, exhausted, entirely private laugh, the laugh of a person who has reached the far end of a very bad day and found something at the bottom of it, and it went through the Duke of Redmayne like a knife through paper. "Are you quite well?" he said. There was an absolute silence in the yard. Then, "Perfectly well, sir," said the maid, who was not a maid, in a voice pitched carefully low and rough. "I did not know anyone was there." "Nor did I, until I heard you laugh." He came to the edge of the terrace and looked down at her, a shape in an apron by a pail, with the light from the kitchen door behind her. "What was so funny?" "Nothing, sir. That is not true, and you are a very poor liar, and I find I am glad of it." "What was funny?" She stood absolutely still for a moment, and then, because she was, as he would learn, incapable of leaving a challenge alone, and because she had been silent for 5 hours and was at the end of her rope, she said, "The fish, sir. The fish." "There was no fish," said the girl. The master ordered a turbot from Rayford, and it did not come, and so the cook took a very old carp out of the stew pond, and dressed it in the sauce that was meant for the turbot, and sent it in, and you ate a piece of it." She paused. "I have been standing in the scullery for an hour and a half waiting for you to die." The Duke of Redmayne laughed. He laughed out loud, in a ruined garden, at 9 o'clock at night, a thing he had not done in company since his brother's death, and the sound of it appeared to startle them both about equally. "I am in excellent health," he said. "You are fortunate," said the girl in the apron. The carp was not. "What is your name?" A pause. He heard her decide. "Rowena, sir." "Rowena," said the Duke. "Well, Rowena, if you should ever find yourself waiting an hour and a half in a scullery for a man to die, you have my permission to come and hurry it along, because you will make a great deal better company than the port." And he went in, and he did not sleep, and at 2 o'clock in the morning he was still lying in the best bedroom of Fenimore Grange, with his hands behind his head, looking at the crack in the ceiling, thinking about ink on the middle finger of a girl's right hand. At 5:30 he gave up on sleep and went down. The house was dead cold and smelled of damp plaster. He had meant to walk out and see the land before breakfast. It was habit, and it told him more in an hour than a steward's book told him in a year. But the door of the library stood ajar with a light behind it, and the Duke of Redmayne, who was not by nature an inquisitive man, and had made a profession of it nonetheless, stopped. She was asleep at the table. There was one candle burned down to the socket, and a shawl over her shoulders, and the Latin grammar open under her cheek, and beside it 3 sheets of paper covered edge to edge in a small hurried hand. She had fallen asleep in the middle of a line. The pen was still in her fingers. Behind her the window was broken and mended with a sheet of paper pasted over the hole, and the paper had come loose at one corner, and the cold came in through it steadily all night onto the back of her neck. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, quietly. He was a large man, and he had learned to be quiet, and looked at the papers without touching them. They were exercises. Her own. She had set them for herself, and she had marked them for herself, with a candour that made him wince. A savage line through a whole paragraph, in the margin, wrong and wrong again, and you know perfectly well what the ablative is for. At the bottom of the 3rd sheet, in a different ink, as though written on another night altogether, she had put down 4 words and then scored through them so hard that the nib had gone through the paper. He could still read them. "Nobody is coming, Rowena." The Duke of Redmayne stood in a freezing library in a ruined house at 20 minutes to 6 in the morning, and something happened in his chest that he had no name for and did not, at that moment, wish to examine. He went out. He got the sheet of paper from the window hole and wedged it back, and it would not hold. So he took his own handkerchief out of his pocket and stuffed it into the gap in the mullion and pressed it home with his thumb, and it held, and the cold stopped coming in. Then he went out and walked 9 miles, and came back for breakfast and said nothing at all. She found the handkerchief. Of course she found it. It was linen of a quality that had no business in that house, and it had a small crown worked into the corner, and he had put it there without thinking, and he had a bad half-hour about it later. But she said nothing either. She looked at him once, across the dinner table, over the shoulder of her talking father, one flick of the eyes gone in an instant, and there was a question in it, and the beginning of something else. He learned the estate in 3 days, the way he always did. He learned that Fenimore had been a good farm and was now a poor one, that Ashby had sold the timber and let the drains go, that there were 11 families on it, and that 4 of them were behind, and that of those 4, 3 had asked for time and been refused. He learned that the old cook, Mrs. Pike, had not been paid since Lady Day and was staying, she told him bluntly on the kitchen step, for the girl and not for him, and I'll thank you not to repeat it. And he learned, in pieces over 9 days in a kitchen yard at 9 o'clock, the shape of a life, that her mother had died when she was 17, and that everything in the house had gone slowly, quietly wrong from that hour. That she had been offered for once, at 19, by a man of 40 with a tannery, and that her father had been enthusiastic, and that she had refused, and had been made to feel it every day for 2 years. That she went to the widow at Slader's Bottom on Sundays with whatever she could carry out of the larder without it being missed, and that this was theft, and that she knew it was theft, and that she had decided she did not care. You will tell me I'm wicked, she said in the dark. I will not. Everyone would. Then everyone is a fool, said the Duke of Redmayne, and I have sat in a chamber full of them for 11 years, and I have never yet heard one of them say a thing half so sensible as that. She was quiet for a moment. You speak very oddly for a clerk, Mr. Hardray. Do I? You speak, said Rowena, like a man who is used to being agreed with. And the Duke of Redmayne stood in the dark with his heart going hard and his mouth entirely dry, and understood that he had 2 choices, and that he was going to take the wrong one, and that he had probably known it since the soup. Good night, Rowena, he said. Good night, Mr. Hardray, she said, and then, as she turned to go in, so quietly that he almost lost it under the sound of the pail, thank you for the window. He should have gone in the morning. He had seen everything he came to see. He stayed 9 days. He told himself it was thoroughness. He wrote to his secretary that the Fenimore business required further examination, which was the first outright lie he had told in 11 years of doing this, and he knew it was a lie while the ink was wet. Mr. Ashby was delighted. Mr. Ashby was so delighted that he could hardly contain himself. He interpreted the extended stay as evidence that the stewardship was as good as his, and he began to speak with a rich, easy confidence of the improvements he would make on the Duke's land, and of the necessity of a firm hand with tenants, and of the ruinous folly of forgiving arrears. They'll swim if you throw 'em in the river, Hardray. They always do. It is the kindest thing in the end, is it? Said the Duke. And every evening the daughter of the house put on a cap that did not fit and carried in a dinner they could not afford, and was called girl, and did not once break. He did not tell her he knew. That was the thing he would answer for afterwards, and he knew it at the time, and he did it anyway. He told himself it was because a gentleman does not strip a woman of the only defence she has. If he said, "Madam, I know you are Miss Ashby," then she would have to stand there in an apron in front of him and be Miss Ashby, and there would be nothing left for her to hide behind, and he had seen what that would cost her in the flicker of her face at the word charity. But the truth he faced on the 4th night, walking the terrace, was baser and simpler, and he despised himself for it. She talked to him. She talked to Mr. Hardray, the Duke's clerk, a plain man of no consequence in a plain coat, in the kitchen yard at 9 o'clock, in the way that a servant may talk to a servant. She would never have talked so to the Duke of Redmayne. Nobody talked so to the Duke of Redmayne. He had 40,000 a year and a face that had been described as a shut door, and he had spent his whole life at the wrong end of everybody's best behavior, and here, in a ruined garden in a borrowed name, a girl with on her fingers said whatever came into her head. "You are very quiet, Mr. Hardray. I am listening." "Nobody listens. It is the most alarming habit I have ever encountered." She set down her pail. "Do you know what I was doing before you came? I was reading. That is all. I read all day. There is nobody here to talk to, and there has been no money for 4 years, and I have read every book in that library twice, including the sermons, which are very bad, and I have begun on the Latin because at least the Latin fights back." "You are learning Latin." "I am learning Latin very slowly and entirely alone, and I make a great many mistakes, and there is not one living soul within 9 miles who could tell me so." She stopped. She had said too much, and she knew it. "Servants do not learn Latin. You are not to repeat that." "I shall not repeat it." "You are looking at me," she said warily, "in the way a man looks at a horse he suspects of having been made up for market." "I am looking at you," said the Duke of Redmayne with perfect truth, "because you are the most interesting thing I have seen in 11 years, and I am attempting to work out how such a thing can have happened in a house like this one." She was silent for a moment. "That is a very improper speech, Mr. Hardray," she said. "You are a clerk and I'm a maid, and neither of us has any business making it or hearing it." "No," he agreed. "So do not make it again." "Very well. Not," said Rowena, "for at least a week." And she took up her pail and went in, and the Duke of Redmayne stood in the dark and laughed silently at the sky. He brought her a book on the 6th day. It was a Latin reader, bought in Rayford, and he left it on the shelf in the passage where she would find it, with no note. Because a note would have been dangerous for her, and he watched from the stairs as she found it, and turned it over, and looked up and down the passage, and then held it against her chest with both arms hard, for a full 3 seconds, with her eyes shut. He had given away a great deal of money in his life. He had endowed a hospital. He had never once felt anything remotely like this, and he stood on a dark staircase in a stranger's house and understood, with a kind of terror, exactly what had happened to him. It came apart on the 9th day, and it came apart because of the arrears. Mr. Ashby had a tenant, a widow at Slade's Bottom, 3/4 behind on her rent, and he had spoken of her twice at dinner with a sort of jovial contempt, and on the 9th morning he ordered the bailiff to put her out. Rowena came into the breakfast room with the coffee, and she was shaking. "Sir," she said, "Mrs. Tolley is at the door." "Then shut it. She has walked 5 miles. She says the roof went in the storm and she cannot, girl." Mr. Ashby did not look up from his paper. "You are a servant in this house, and you will be silent, or you may go and join her on the road and see how you like it. I have been more than patient with you. I have kept you out of the goodness of my heart when any other man would have." "She has nowhere to go," said Rowena. "Nor will you," said her father, "if you speak to me again." There was a small crash. The coffee pot had gone over on the sideboard. Nobody moved to right it, and the Duke of Redmayne stood up. He did it slowly, and he did it without raising his voice, and the 2 people in that room turned to look at him with identical expressions of astonishment, because the quiet clerk in the plain coat had, in the space of 1 second, become something entirely else. His whole bearing had changed. It was the thing that happened in the Lords when he rose. Men who had never seen it did not forget it. "Mr. Ashby," he said, "sit down. I beg your sit down." Mr. Ashby sat down. "You will pay Mrs. Tolley's arrears out of your own pocket this morning," said the Duke of Redmayne, "and you will mend her roof, and you will do it before the week is out. Not because it is right, though it is. You have no interest in what is right, and I have been listening to you demonstrate it for 9 days. You will do it because if you do not, I shall write a letter to His Grace." "To His Grace," the Duke agreed. The blood went out of Mr. Ashby's face, and then came back into it redder. "Now see here, Hardray. You are a clerk. You are a paid man, sir, a hireling, and you take a very great deal upon yourself. And I'll thank you to remember which of us is a gentleman, and which of us is a servant," said the Duke. "Yes, I have been reminded of that a good deal in this house, chiefly at the expense of the young woman standing behind you, who has waited on you for 9 days without a footman or a wage or a single civil word. and whose hands you have not once looked at, those you might have learned a great deal if you had. Rowena had gone white to the lips. Sir, don't. Miss Ashby, said the Duke of Redmayne gently, I have known since the soup. The silence in that breakfast room went on a long time. Mr. Ashby's mouth worked. He looked at his daughter in her cap and apron, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in 4 years, and what was in his face was not shame, not yet. It was calculation, running fast and coming out badly. It was a household expedient, he said. The girl is a wilful creature, Hardray. She insisted upon it. She would have it that we could not receive you without a servant. I insisted upon it, said Rowena. There, you hear. Because you told me, she said, in a voice like a thread pulled tight, that if the Duke's man saw how we lived, you should not have the place, and we should lose the Grange, and it would be my doing. You told me that on Tuesday, in the library, with the window broken behind you. And I put on Susan's cap, Susan, who left in June because we could not pay her, and I served the soup, and you called me a slow creature and said you kept me out of charity, and I did not answer you, and I have not answered you for 9 days. She untied the apron. She did it with steady hands, which the Duke of Redmayne thought afterwards was the bravest thing he had ever watched anyone do, and she folded it and laid it on the sideboard beside the fallen coffee pot, and took off the cap. Her hair came down. She did not put it up. I am Rowena Ashby, she said to the man in the plain coat, and I have been lying to you since Monday, and I am ashamed of it, and I am not ashamed of the reason. There, now write your letter. The Duke of Redmayne looked at her across the wreck of the breakfast table. I am going to say something, he said, and you will not like the first part of it. I have not liked any part of the last 9 days. That is not true either, he said. You liked the yard at 9 o'clock. So did I. It was the only hour of the day I did not despise. She looked away sharply. My name, said the Duke, is Piers Hardray Redmayne. Hardray was my mother's name. I have used it since I was 24, when my father died, having been robbed for 30 years by men who bowed very low to his face. I have made it my practice, whenever a place of mine falls vacant, to go and look at the candidate in his own house, under a plain name, at his own table, because a man will bow to a duke, but he will show you exactly what he is by the way he speaks to a servant. He paused. There is no duke to write to, Miss Ashby. I am the Duke of Redmayne. Mr. Ashby made a sound. It was not a word. It was a sort of soft collapsing noise, the noise of a man watching 800 a year in a house go over a cliff in front of him, and he put his hand out and gripped the edge of the table, and neither of them looked at him. Rowena Ashby had not moved at all. 9 days, she said. 9 days. I carried your dinner. You did. I stood in the yard and told you about the carp. Her voice was rising now, and it was worse than shouting. It was quite quiet, and it shook. I told you I was learning Latin alone. I told you there was nobody within 9 miles who could correct me. I told you I had read the sermons twice, and you stood there in your plain coat and let me, and you knew who you were the entire time, and you knew what I was, and you let me stand in an apron and say all of it. Yes, said the Duke. Why? Because you would not have said 1 word of it to a duke, he said, and I wanted to hear it. That is the whole of my defence, and it is not a good one, and I have known it was not a good one since the 4th night, and I stayed anyway. She turned away from him and put both hands over her face. The book, she said, muffled. Yes, you bought me the book. I did. I have slept with it under my pillow like a child, said Rowena Ashby, because it was the first thing anybody has given me since my mother died, and I thought it was from a poor clerk who could not afford it. And it, Your Grace, do you know what that book cost you? Nothing. It cost you nothing at all. And the Duke of Redmayne, who had faced down the Lords, who had been called the coldest man in the north, who had not been touched by anything in 11 years, found that he could not breathe. You are quite right, he said. He crossed the room. He stopped at a proper distance, because he had already taken far too much from her without asking. It cost me nothing, he said, and that is the true difference between us, and it will always be the true difference, and no marriage and no settlement and no name will ever quite mend it. I will not stand here and tell you it is nothing. It is not nothing. I have spent 11 years being nobody in other men's houses, and I have learned everything there is to know about how the world treats the powerless, and I have never once, not once, been powerless myself. I do not know what that costs. You do. She lowered her hands. Then why are you standing so close? She whispered. Because I am going to ask you something, said the Duke of Redmayne, and I want to be able to see your face when you refuse me. Your Grace, Piers. I cannot possibly call you. You called me Hardray in a kitchen yard and told me the fish was poisoned, he said. I have never in my life been happier than I was at that moment, and I did not know what was happening to me, and I know now, and I would rather say it badly than not say it at all. He drew a breath. Marry me. Not for the Grange. I will save the Grange whatever you answer, and I will do it for the sake of the widow at Slade's Bottom and the 9 other families your father has been squeezing, and not for you, so that it can never be a payment. Not for rescue. You have not asked to be rescued, and I do not think you would take it. I would not. I know. His mouth moved, not quite a smile. That is rather the point of you. Rowena Ashby stood in the middle of a ruined breakfast room with her hair down and her apron folded on the sideboard, and she looked at him for a long, long time. You lied to me, she said. I did. Do you intend to make a habit of it? No, said the Duke of Redmayne. I intend to spend the rest of my life being told, in a kitchen yard, exactly what I am, by the only person who has ever been willing to do it. That is not a penance, Rowena. It is the single thing I want in this world, and I have wanted it for 9 days, and I shall want it when I am 80. And Rowena Ashby began, helplessly, to cry and to laugh, both at once, with her hands pressed to her mouth. There was no turbot, she said. I know. There was never any turbot. There's been no turbot in this house for 4 years. Then we shall have one, said the Duke of Redmayne, every Friday for the rest of our lives, and you may throw it at me when I deserve it. Her father did not get the stewardship. He did not lose the Grange either, though he came within a fortnight of it. The mortgage was bought in by a very quiet lawyer, and the arrears at Slade's Bottom were paid, and Mrs. Tolley's roof was mended before the frost, and Mr. Edmund Ashby found himself, at 58, the tenant of his own house. On terms so scrupulously fair and so publicly known that he could neither complain of them nor squeeze another soul as long as he lived. He tried, once, to tell the story at Rayford as though he had arranged the match himself. Nobody believed him. It is one of the small mercies of a small county that everybody knows everything. They were married in the spring, in the church at Fenimore, and the bride wore her mother's gown made over, and the Duke of Redmayne stood at the altar in front of 400 people and could not stop looking at her hands. She was Duchess of Redmayne for 41 years. She learned her Latin properly, out of a great many books, from a tutor who came from Cambridge and told the Duke privately that her Grace should have had a fellowship, and in time she taught it badly at first, and then very well, to the daughters of half the tenantry. In a schoolroom she had built out of her own pin money at the gate of the park, and which she opened herself every Monday morning for 30 years. The old practice ended. The Duke of Redmayne never again put on a plain coat and went to look at a man in his own house, and when his secretary asked him why, he said only that he had found what he was looking for and had no further use for the disguise. But every year, on the last night of September, husband and wife went out after dinner and stood together on the terrace of whichever house they were in the dark, with the pails and the kitchen doors 20 years behind them. You are very quiet, she would say. I am listening. Nobody listens, said the Duchess of Redmayne every year without fail, and every year it undid him exactly as thoroughly as it had the first time. It is the most alarming habit I have ever encountered. And he would take her ink-stained hand in both of his and hold it, and say nothing whatever, because she had told him, in a kitchen yard, that he was the only man who had ever heard her, and because he had made up his mind that night that she should never in her life go unheard again.